In some respects, a diverse group of talks that we've just heard, so I'm trying to come up with a theme to pull it all together. And one thing that occurred to me, perhaps in each area, is how does the public perception of a disease impact upon the patient's care? I mean, we've heard about the fact that people don't necessarily realise what a brain injury is, and the patient might actually look fairly normal. I guess irritable bowel syndrome particularly, because there's not much to see, as you described. And I guess also with hepatitis, there's a bit of stigma about hepatitis and whether that, in fact, impacts upon people's willingness to accept therapy. And I just wonder if you might each reflect on how the public perception of your individual diseases impacts on care and how we might get around that. And perhaps I'll start with Emma.
That's a great question, Paul. I guess with hepatitis C in particular, I alluded to the attendance rate being poor because some people do potentially perceive that a bit of a stigma, that they feel that being in the liver clinic where they may have perhaps tried intravenous drugs once in their 20s, now they're in their 60s, that they don't really fit into this demographic of infection with hepatitis C. But it's equally relevant to those people as well. And furthermore, now that we've got essentially a cure for this condition and we spend $1.2 billion on this, people think, oh yeah, let's move on to something else now. But in reality, I don't think we're actually quite done. So public perception is really important to know exactly where the issues are and having awareness that this condition is very much curative, especially we came from a background where hepatitis C had very toxic drugs that people still have lingering thoughts about. That is no longer the case.
Yeah, look, I think the theme of stigma is absolutely right. So I think the thing that does link our patient engagement and all of our research work and presentations has been around how do we get the really good information and the good treatment we've got out to all the people who would benefit. And it's stigma and a lack of community discussion on these things that is the barrier. So with both inflammatory bowel disease and irritable bowel syndrome, the issue is it's not sexy to talk about your bowels. We as a community don't talk about farting. We don't talk about... No, but seriously, so people are laughing, and that's great because that's how I approach it. We don't talk about fecal incontinence, and that is one of the most devastating things that can happen to anybody. We know that a lot of our patients are terrified they will get a stoma. We also know that if they do come to getting a stoma, that most of them think, oh my God, I should have had it at least a year ago on average. So this is all stuff we need to normalise. So young kids and certainly boys talk about farting and poo. Girls are given the message that you mustn't talk about this stuff, and adults, it's a taboo. And that's ridiculous when we have social media with people with nudity, with all sorts of interesting sexual practice, with all sorts of interesting social practice, but we can't talk about bodily function. So I think we just have to be humorous and break down those barriers so that we can deliver what we already have out to the people who need it.
Yeah, look, I think with brain injury, certainly our research has shown that what patients feel is that their symptoms aren't validated. People don't actually understand it. So when they're feeling strange, or their eyes aren't working properly, or they're feeling dizzy, or they can't think properly, people look at them and think, well, gosh, you had this 6 weeks ago, you should be back at work by now. And they wonder whether they're going crazy. They actually wonder whether, are they imagining this? So I think that is about, again, people not understanding what brain injury is, the complexity of brain injury, that it really, your brain is your computer. It affects everything you do, the way you think, the way you feel. So I think there is certainly a lot more education that we need to provide so that people understand what can happen after a brain injury.
In fact, go back in on this, because I think the other thing, listening to Maggie talk, and out of some of our work as well, and I think it's with the Hep C patients too, is that we tend to have got very dichotomised that something's a physical illness or it's a mental illness. And through the work that I've been doing, and I think what Maggie's talking about as well, and Eddie and I sort of work in a similar area with the liver patients, is that we've kind of tended to apply a medical physical model to stuff and ignore the psychological and the social. And we are finding very much that we can't deliver the good medical model if we don't account for the mental health and psychosocial stuff.
Absolutely. One of the questions from the audience was in regard to the brain injury, and it's ironic, they said once it's cured or you're healed up, and that's interesting because that's sometimes nebulous to know that. What ongoing monitoring do people need? Is this something that you know, that they need ongoing monitoring for the rest of their lives, or how does that work?
And I guess that depends on what we talk about, you know, being healed, and because often we do look at the physical aspects, or we look at communication, or being able to eat again, for example. But of course, brain injury also can affect, you know, the way you feel. It can cause depression and anxiety, and can affect the way you think. You might think a little slower. So I guess the thing is that if you really are back to where you were, basically the main thing you have to do is make sure you don't get another head injury and try and protect your head, because, you know, the second head injury is always it often isn't as favourable outcome as the first. But I guess be really vigilant that if you have had a brain injury, that you sort of keep an eye on your emotions, the way you feel, not just the way you walk. And if people do feel that, oh gee, I'm really feeling sad, or you know, flat, or whatever, or gosh, I'm getting a bit confused, or I'm seem to take a lot, getting overwhelmed when I'm at a party or conversations, just make sure that you sort of think, well, gosh, that might be something from my brain injury. Maybe I need to go and see my GP and discuss that and see if there's some help out there. So, yeah, because it can go on for quite a long time, and you can get support to help those symptoms.